Hey everyone, just wanted to go ahead and check in with all of you. I'm doing like a camera display, watching myself on that screen and then looking over here, so I apologize for that. And I just ate a whole sleeve of Ritz crackers, so I'll probably have to stop for water. But congratulations on week 2, or at least completing week 2 of content, which is interesting. Because we get to see from the very start the differences in opinion as to what constitutes as a new versus an old communication technology, which is interesting mostly because there are easily distinguishable differences between the two and some benefits that we have to some of the newer communication technologies. Everything, some of the comments included ideas of mobility or speed, accessibility, and in general the addition of cues. All those seem to be pretty important ideas that led us to really differentiate into this idea that new communication technologies are very important. But, as a lot of people, some of the more cynical people in the classroom, myself maybe included within this bunch, think the idea of being constantly connected certainly has its implications. What I find interesting is that a lot of people are identifying qualities of older communication technologies that are now present in new communication technologies and not really being able to differentiate them from one into another. And I'll give you an example. Think about instant messaging. Now, instant messaging, for the most part, has been a communication technology for just over 20 years now. And especially when you consider the fact that email, in many respects, actually utilizes the instant message component, we get some interesting dialogues here. And think about the way that you use UWM's email as it's sort of facilitated by Microsoft. Not only do we have the email component, but we have the messaging component that is used in conjunction with it. So not only can you send a formalized email, but you can actually message a person, very similar to GChat for a lot of you who work in corporate settings and use that, HipChat, and a variety of other communication technologies. But it's old, right? Old communication technologies are finding their ways into new communication technologies as a new function or new ability. Facebook in itself, very new communication technology, utilizes Facebook Messenger. Yes, they rebranded and they repackaged it as a new component that has its own app, and it's fun and it's new and it's creative and it has a really loud and annoying pinging noise for when you actually get a message. But that's an old communication technology. It just happens to be featured in the new ones. I think the Southwell article makes an interesting claim in that communication technologies don't necessarily change the way we behave. Instead, the way that we communicate, or I guess communication in general, is really motivated by the channels for which communication actually occurs. For example, what is it that we actually do with these communication technologies? Is it the communication technology that influences the way that we communicate, or is it us that influences the way that we actually use communication technologies? And I think that's a sort of trick question that leads into a lot of rhetorical traps. I think it's a cyclical relationship. The way that we want to communicate is oftentimes influenced by the way that we do communicate with these technologies. And also accessibility to these communication technologies ultimately influences what do we have accessible. I could call my significant other, but I have Skype or FaceTime. And so that in itself, the decisions that we make in communicating and using these technologies is very interesting. Also, I think a conversation that we had on a couple of different threads is this notion that the accessibility or maybe the ease of access of new communication technologies actually discourages face-to-face interaction, which to a certain extent I can agree. And I've seen it myself, and I'll put some younger family members a little bit on blast here. But it's much easier now, with the advent of communication technologies, to actually, let's say, from the interpersonal chapter, romantic relationships, since we're covering that next week as a good preface, we can, instead of going out and having this grand romantic gesture, we can actually invite someone to, let's say, prom, if that's something you're interested in, via text message. And some people on the receiving end of that might think, wow, this is great. Steve wants to take me to prom. I'm so excited. But on the other end, some of us who are a little bit older and more jaded would go, back in my day, that sort of older expression. And so I don't think it's necessarily a good or a bad thing that we have more access to communication technologies, but the perception at which we actually rate or justify certain behaviors is much more important. And oftentimes we think about this notion of people using communication technologies to either compensate for sort of gratification that we have in interpersonal relationships or use it as an alternative. So I'll give you an example. The attributions we make about people, let's say someone who is constantly connected to their phone. You have a friend who is always checking his or her phone. They're very much so addicted, as we would pretty prototypically call it, to their social media. So they're always on Twitter, they're always on Facebook, they're always on Instagram, and they're interacting with people in that way. Well, on the one hand, we can say that they are using those platforms, these communication technologies, as an alternative to meeting face-to-face relational gratification. So the need to feel wanted, or the need to feel like you are supported, social support, as it's sort of provided to you by computer-mediated communication. On the other hand, we could say this person has a high need for feeling connected to people, and so they just happen to use that communication technology to bolster or really help this notion of the rich get richer phenomenon. And so overall, I think it's just based on the way that we actually frame arguments. There is not a necessarily correct answer as we're talking about communication technologies in terms of social compensation, but instead I think the notion of the McKenna article is sort of a combination model, in that some people might find it particularly difficult to actually maintain relationships or communicate. If they have communication apprehension, it's okay for them to struggle in a public speaking course because we identify it, but when they enter the real world, we all of a sudden are very critical of them. And I don't think that's necessarily fair. So what we need to consider is, how is it that we can justify certain behaviors with communication technologies? And more importantly, what are our communication technologies? And I think this is something that a lot of people start to mention within their comments. And it's very self-reflective, and good on you if you have high self-monitoring. But people would go, I don't always use communication technologies, but I can understand when people would. And I think that's great. And I think that admittance that maybe the way that you communicate isn't the way that everyone should communicate is good. But we also get people who are more so on the bandwagon of, okay, I communicate this way, I think my way is the best. And that ego, that sort of selfishness with understanding communication technologies is unfortunately wrong, right? So that's about it for my recap for week 2, overview of communication technologies. Next week we start interpersonal communication, which is going to be fun. I think that is probably the reason why it's within the first unit, and I think the overview of communication technologies gives you your first glimpse at understanding this material. Interpersonal communication is interesting because a lot of people, hopefully, can relate to the ideas that we are talking about within this. Okay, now that isn't an invitation to actually have you use it as a platform to maybe talk about your interpersonal struggles. That might be something that you want to seek out professional help, or a friend, or talk to the person even. I know you have different ways to talk to the person, as we talked about with old and new communication technologies. You can use smoke signal if you want to go old-fashioned, or you can actually text them, which is relatively new. But it's up to you. And I think our insights and our comments, as helpful as they are to ourselves to understand it, actually help the way that other people understand it. Because it has been my experience, and actually observing other people, who will hear a story and go, I never thought of it that way. And a simple anecdote, a simple way to actually bring that to life, adding your own perspective, actually does help a lot of people. So for those of you who are doing that and want to continue doing that to help people, awesome. And for those of you who didn't and might want to think about it, it's something that's on the table. But again, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please let me know. I'll be doing these sort of weekly recaps, anticipated every week. And if there's any other content that you wanted me to talk about, I've got a sweet headset and a camera, so we could do that. Alright, team. Talk to you soon.